Welcome to the IUCN UK Peatland Programme Conference 2023 entitled Beyond Restoration. My name's Stuart Brooks and I'm currently the IUCN UK Peatland Programme Chair and as my day job is the National Trust for Scotland Director of Conservation and Policy. So thanks for being here, thanks for joining us online. Lots of people. I think Emma told me that we've got over 340 people, not everybody in the room, but we filled the room, which is pretty impressive. And there's a whole host of people online too. So thank you for traveling down to Ely or up to Ely or across to Ely. And some people are also going to be joining us from a bit further afield outside of the UK. I don't think there are many places more apt, really, and relevant to the future of sustainable management of peatlands in the UK than our vantage point here, just a few metres above sea level, and some of you at the back are even, you're probably the highest position in the Fens currently. This being the Isle of Ely, the district of Eels. So it's an ancient place of immense wealth. Its height of influence, obviously, in the medieval period, which gave rise to that absolutely magnificent cathedral on the hill. And if you get there, you must go and visit, take the opportunity while you're here. And I didn't get a chance to go in yesterday, but I understand that that amazing table that was hewed out of the bog oak, 5,000-year-old bog oak, graces the cathedral. This is a pretty special place for me. So back in the 19th century, my family were farmers and barge people here on the Cambridgeshire Fens. And some of my earliest memories as a child was travelling across the Fens, those big open landscapes with those huge skies, the endless drains. I couldn't really understand why these rivers were just straight, and we just used to drive for miles and miles and miles along these drains. So I'm just so delighted that we're here in Ely, in the middle of the Fens. So the theme of this year's conference is Beyond Restoration. So it's a theme, I think, that speaks of optimistic change, a reversal of the drying out of the Fens here and the catastrophic loss of the peat. The return of the wildfowl, cash crops such as willow and reeds and sphagnum moss even, and maybe one day perhaps the most emblematic return of the critically endangered eel. So the IUCN UK Peatland Programme exists to promote peatland restoration in the UK and advocates for the multiple benefits of peatlands through partnerships, strong science, sound policy, and effective practice. And that mix has really stood us in good stead over the last 14, 15 years or so. And over the next 3 days, our peatland community, you, will have the opportunity to hear from and speak with the leaders across all of these disciplines and challenge ourselves to think about a wet future beyond restoration. So, most important thing is to enjoy the conference, meeting old friends, and as I get a bit older, actually, I find that I recognize fewer and fewer people in the audience, but I think that's a really good thing. So please go and make some new friends as well, and learn from each other. That's the point, isn't it, of coming together. And I do hope that our presence here can boost enthusiasm for restoration of a degraded peatland landscape to one which is even more richer in culture, nature, and livelihoods. Well, you know, put them to silent. Okay, so I've got the pleasure of introducing Trudy Harrison. So Trudy's the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for DEFRA, and the Minister's going to give an opening address, and I think it should just play. That's all right? Or do I press play?
I'd first like to thank the International Union for Conservation of Nature for organising this conference series, which affords a unique opportunity for policymakers, scientists, land managers and practitioners from the 4 nations to learn from one another on the vitally important topic of peatland restoration and management. The IUCN does a fantastic job championing peatlands and encouraging coordination across the UK. And I know that you'll have many opportunities over the next 3 days to network and to share knowledge. We all know that healthy peatlands offer a myriad of benefits for water quality, reducing the risk of flood, drought and wildfire, in providing habitat for rare and unusual plants, birds and insects, and for controlling emissions of harmful greenhouse gases. If we are to stop emitting carbon from our peat soils and encourage them to become havens for nature, then we need to look after them, to re-wet them and better manage them. In the first few weeks in my role as DEFRA's Minister for Environment, I visited a Nature for Climate funded upland peat restoration site in Lancashire, seeing the difference that restoration techniques were having on the ground. I later visited a paludiculture trial managed by the Wildlife Trust at Rindle Moss, where it was encouraging to see the collaboration between researchers at university and local farmers and landowners supplying the crops. There are numerous varied peaty areas in the UK, and Ely seems a particularly appropriate place to hold a conference on peat. It is in the Fens, where large-scale drainage of the peat soils for agriculture first took place in England many centuries ago. As a result, this area now faces some unique challenges. Between the 1600s and the 1980s, 84% of the deep peat in the East Anglian Fens was lost. Without action, in 30 to 50 years' time, the Fens may no longer be an appropriate place to host a conference on peat. We need to halt that decline here and elsewhere in the UK. Yes, different areas of the UK have unique problems to tackle, but many peaty areas, whether upland or lowland, face shared challenges. I'm pleased to see there are workshops in the next few days which will address the topics such as paludiculture and water management. It is collaboration on issues such as these and collective efforts to fill the data gaps that exist that will help us to find solutions and to reach our common goals. Work to improve the situation of our peat soils is a long-term undertaking, especially in our agricultural lowlands, where a considerable amount of research is still needed, and it will require a lot of cross-sector collaboration. But we cannot afford to wait until all the data is in. We must act now if we are to leave the environment in a better state for the next generation. And our support, our domestic food production and all the livelihoods that rely on it. The government has already taken important steps. We have committed to invest in over £50 million in peat restoration, building on our pledge to restore approximately 35,000 hectares of peatland in England by the end of this Parliament. In August this year, we announced 12 new projects located from the Great North Bog to the Norfolk Broads and stretching from Somerset to County Durham, which will receive £16 million under the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme to drive collaboration and supercharge peatland restoration. We have a pipeline of peatland research and development planned to address key knowledge and gaps and to ensure that we're utilising the best available evidence. This includes the launch of a £6.6 million lowland peat programme to understand the opportunities and feasibility of sustainable management options, as well as wider research exploring the relationships between peatland management, condition, restoration and outcomes. We are also supporting the Environment Agency to carry out a research and development programme over the next 2 years. In June, we saw publication of a report by the chair of the Independent Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force, a group tasked by government to explore how England's farmed lowland peatlands can be better managed to preserve the carbon stored in them. In our government response, we agreed to take action on all of the report's 14 recommendations, also acknowledging the central finding that water management in the lowlands is key to the future of these landscapes and the people who live there. The work of the task force led us to launch a £2 million water discovery pilot and a £5 million small infrastructure pilot, and we've also seen the start of projects funded by £5 million of Polludiculture Exploration Fund grants. But the focus of the conference this year is beyond restoration, because we need to look to the future and we need to go further. One of the biggest challenges we currently face is a path forward from restoration. We know that we need to develop a better understanding of the size of the sector and its capacity to deliver the change we all want to see, now and in the future. In response, DEFRA has recently commissioned a significant research project that will help us to understand the workforce growth needed. Government is also aware that for farmers and land managers to change the way they do things, it needs to be financially viable. And that's why DEFRA is updating, improving and increasing its support for farmers and land managers who, let's face it, know their land best, including through the environmental land management schemes. The government's ELM scheme will provide the main delivery mechanism for peatland restoration from 2025 onwards, and the current Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme acts as an important precursor to accelerate delivery of peatland restoration. We're also developing our countryside stewardship offers to support wetter modes of farming, including incentives to safely and sustainably raise water levels below the ground surface. There is a lot of work going into making these offers more flexible and attractive, as well as into expanding funding for supporting capital items and into expanding the provision of technical advice available to farmers. We will set out more detail on these offers, including improved payment rates, later this year. I'm also aware of the importance of developing markets to help deliver on our environmental goals. To this end, DEFRA has funded our hosts, the IUCN, to develop the Peatland Code. We were delighted to see the code updated earlier this year to include lowland fen. We hope to further expand the code to include polludiculture as soon as we have more data. Through the Polludiculture Exploration Fund, we're also looking to develop new markets for fibre and food crops grown on high water tables. We have many projects underway, looking, for example, at new markets for willow products and typha seed heads, which are being used by one company for such innovative purposes as making a replacement for goose down in padded jackets. Polludiculture can, of course, also produce water-tolerant food crops, such as celery, wild rice and blueberry. The government is committed to addressing peat degradation, whether in bogs, marshes and mosses, or in broads, levels and fen. They form a really important part of our net zero ambition. We're gathering the data and evidence to inform our policy and want to work with and support farmers, land managers, water managers and other key stakeholders to achieve a transformation in the way we manage water in our peat landscapes. This will all go towards ensuring we keep carbon locked up in the ground, create rich biodiverse habitats and secure the future of those who rely on the soils for their livelihoods.
It was an excellent opening address, I think, because it touches on pretty much all of the themes that the conference is going to be exploring. And I know the minister's not here because there's something else going on in Manchester. But, you know, reach out to her, connect via social media. That's what politicians are really good at doing these days. And thank her if nothing else. Okay, we're going to move on and kind of still staying at that kind of very high level. I'm delighted to be introducing Indra Tillanathan. Indra comes to us from the Climate Change Committee, and Indra is going to be talking to us about sustainable management of peatlands and its contribution to delivering net zero.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Excuse me if I keep looking down, but there's a monitor down there that also shows the slides. Yeah, so just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'll be covering at a high UK level the emissions for UK land use, and also a part of that is also the emissions that comes from our peatlands. The role of peat re-wetting and sustainable management in delivering the net zero target that we have by 2050, and also the benefits that re-wetting, having better management of peats can deliver in terms of climate adaptation and resilience, and the upcoming work programme for the CCC, which will focus on the advice for the 7th carbon budget and CCRA 4A. So just a quick overview of the role of the Climate Change Committee. So we're the UK's independent advisor on tackling climate change. We're independent, we're a statutory body, and we were established as part of the Climate Change Act in 2008. Our statutory duties require us to advise the UK and the devolved governments on emissions, the setting of emissions targets, and we report annually to Parliament on the progress that the government is making in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also preparing for and adapting to the impacts of climate change. We now have a legislated net zero target by 2050, and one of our key roles is to advise on the setting of carbon budgets. So for each carbon budget period, which runs for 5 years, we have a limit on the amount of emissions that can be emitted over that 5-year period. So back at the end of 2020, we advised on the setting of the 6th carbon budget. So that's the period roughly covering 2032 to 2030. And that was accepted by government, and we now have a legislated target to reduce UK-wide emissions by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990. So it's quite an ambitious target. We're uploading a lot of that emissions reduction in the first 15 years. But hopefully, yeah, let's see where we get to. So looking at land use change emissions, so this chart shows you the greenhouse gas inventory for the land use change and forestry sector. So this shows you the emissions that comes out of changing your use of land. So we can see that the sort of chunks of colour below the x-axis is the net removals that's coming from predominantly forestry, and anything above the x-axis are the net sources of emissions, and that's predominantly coming from cropland. The dotted line gives us the net position, so we can see that since 1990 there's been a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from this particular sector across the UK. And that's largely been driven by a steady rate of afforestation since the 1960s, which peaked in the 1980s when afforestation rates were reaching around 30,000 hectares a year. There has been a decline in that rate of decrease though, so you can see in the last 10 to 12 years that dotted line is more or less flat, and that's because we've got an ageing profile of UK forestry. Our afforestation rates have decreased dramatically since the highs of the 1980s, so that the ability of our existing forests to sequester more carbon has sort of dropped off really. So that's the position for the sector, but what this chart doesn't give us is the emissions that comes from peatlands, which is now given in this chart. So we can see that peatland emissions by 2021, which is the latest year we have data for, is just under 16 megatons of CO2 per year. And so that constitutes like an 18% reduction since 1990. And 40% of that reduction's actually come from forestry on peatland. So in Scotland, there's been targets in place, or rather, efforts in place to remove low productive woodlands off trees, so that off peat rather, and that's actually seen a reduction in that top purple chunk, which corresponds to forestry on peat. In grassland, there's agri-environmental schemes which has reduced stocking rates in the uplands, has also produced a decrease in emissions from that particular land use type. So this chart's quite interesting. So what it does, it shows for each land use type on peatland, it shows you the share of the land area of peatland. So that corresponds to the purple chart. So this here corresponds to, so roughly 16% of UK peatland is under forestry. And then the yellow chunk here tells us of the total UK peat emissions, how much of it is given for each land use type. So we can see for forestry, it's quite a small share. Now, when we look at croplands, about 7% of the UK land area is taken up, UK peatland area is taken up by cropland, but it's quite small. But we can see in terms of the amount of emissions, as a proportion of all UK peatland emissions, it's almost a quarter. So what's that's telling us, it's that cropland, because it's heavily degraded, is actually emitting a lot of emissions on a per hectare basis for a year. So depending on the depth of the peat, so this this range here includes both less than 40 centimetres and over 40 centimetres of peat depth. Cropland is emitting between 26 and 37 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per year. So very high. And obviously that's a result of the extensive drainage that's happened, and the level of degradation is quite high. In comparison, a forestry is much smaller, and extracted domestic peat for horticultural use, for example, is around 15. In contrast, near natural fens, so this is like your good condition peatland, is a net sequesterer of carbon. So obviously what we want to do is try to reduce these per hectare emissions where we can through various abatement options. And just to say that UK peatland occupies about 12% of total land area. So that's the picture of the emissions. So we want to go on and look at how we can bring these emissions down, both in total but on a per hectare basis. So this is the work we were doing for the 6 carbon budget. So we looked at the role that restoration of peatland, re-wetting, and the sustainable management of cropland peat could help in delivering that net zero target by 2050. And in our calculations, we estimated that increasing the area of re-wetted peat to almost 80% of UK peatland area, combined with the sustainable management of around 35% of lowland cropland peat, could reduce emissions by 2050 by 2050. I hesitate at this stage now to present that in terms of total emissions, because obviously the evidence has moved on since 2020 in terms of the emissions per hectare basis, for example. So I'll just stick to these percentages for now. And so the range of abatement measures we looked at, as well as re-wetting to near natural conditions. So for the lowlands, we looked at re-wetting, where you take agricultural production off and you re-wet to near natural condition. We also looked at re-wetting by switching from conventional agricultural production to paludiculture. And we also looked at sustainable management of lowland peat. So you're still retaining conventional crop production, but what can you do to that water table to bring it up that would allow you to reduce emissions, but also continue with conventional agricultural production? And we looked at 2 different types of water table management options there. So the dynamic one is about raising the water table to an optimum level that allows ongoing production plus some reduction in emissions. And I think the water table stays more or less the same throughout the year. And the seasonal one, it was more about raising the water table by a higher level during the winter when you've got no crops, assuming you've got no crops in the ground, and then dropping that water table when there is crops being grown, for example. We obviously looked at restoring upland peat and removing low productive trees of less than yield class 8 off peat, similar to what's already been done in Scotland, but we extended that to all of the area, and also the re-wetting of extraction sites. So that would mean cessation of all activities by a certain date, which I think we had down was by 2035 that there would be no further peat extraction for horticultural use by 2035. So, as I mentioned, we will be looking at all of these abatement measures again in light of more recent evidence. So obviously taking on board work that's coming out of DEFRA's lowland sustainable intensification work. We'll be looking at those abatement options and also reassessing the ongoing evidence where we now have better estimates of peatland emissions. So in addition to climate change mitigation, there's obviously a range of co-benefits that can be delivered that's key for climate adaptation and resilience. Some of them which the Minister mentioned earlier, but obviously in terms of improving the productive capacity of lowland soils, slowing the water in the uplands so that can alleviate the risks of downstream flooding, improving the water quality and enhancing and increasing biodiversity. Also, having peat in a much better condition also makes it more resilient to the risks of the warmer climate. So we know that as the climate gets warmer and dry conditions are likely to increase the rate of carbon losses from degraded peatlands, reduce the water holding and filtering capacity as well. So yeah, key to get this all sorted, ahead of the negative impacts that will probably come with a warmer climate. And the longer the delay in reversing the degradation, the more expensive it will become. Because evidence does show that for many interventions, the benefits substantially outweigh the costs. So that red line just covers upland restoration. So what was looked at was that the costs of restoration. So for example, if you spend £1 to restore upland peat, it could deliver you benefits of up to £12. So the cost-benefit ratio can be up to 12, 1 to 12. That range is sort of was taken across a range of different upland peatland sites. So the evidence came from a range of different upland peatland sites, but it was found that net benefits of restoration was found to increase more if more ecosystem services were included, if you were able to take on board a much longer time period. Obviously, more benefits are probably likely to occur the longer the time period is looked at. And obviously, the greater the assumed pace and extent of climate change. So, definite cost-benefit evidence there that was drawn out in the CCRA 3 on the benefits of restoration. So, yeah, 1 minute. Okay, this is my last slide. So in terms of our upcoming work programme for the CCC, so our 7th Carbon Budget Advice will be published in early 2025. And as I mentioned, we want to be able to update our abatement potential to reflect a host of different things, including, updated evidence of peatland emissions. We're in a much better position than we were 3 years ago in terms of knowing the condition, location of an extent of peatland under different land use types. It's still not perfect, but it's definitely moved on. We want to draw on evidence from DEFRA's Sustainable Lowland Peatland Project, and we also want to consider, does our abatement pathway still stack up when we factor in a warmer climate as well? There's also our advice for the CCRA 4A, which will come out a year later. Work on that is very early stages, so not too much to say on that, apart from there are plans to have stakeholder groups on risks to soil. So as part of this whole exercise, we're very keen to engage with stakeholders as we develop our thinking on both of these key pieces of work. So, please come to me. I've got my colleague Marilli somewhere here as well. So please come to the two of us during the course of today. And if you're not able to speak to us, then I've got my email address there, and we'll be happy to, to receive, contact from you, especially if you've got updated evidence that could be useful for our work. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thanks very much, Indra. If it's okay, Indra's going to join us for the panel session after this next bit. So please start thinking about questions. We've got a reasonable amount of time that we can have a discussion and ask questions. So just formulate those, and we'll come to those after this next bit. So this next bit is looking at progress against the UK peatland strategy. So I think there were copies that I saw as I came in on the table on the right-hand side. So the IUCN UK peatland programme led the development of the UK peatland strategy, and that was launched back in 2018. So it's 5 years. So it's kind of good chunk of time to be able to demonstrate some progress. No pressure there. The apex target in the strategy is 2 million hectares of peatland to be in good condition or under restoration or being sustainably managed by 2040. So I'll introduce our first speaker. So we're going to, and I think I'll just kind of let you know the order, and then as speakers finish, we can just swap over. There's no point in me just coming up and telling you who people are, because they can introduce themselves. So we're going to go in no particular order. So Dave Foster from DAERA Northern Ireland first, and then Claire McFadden from Scotland, Scottish Government, and then we've got a trio. So Christopher Moses from DEFRA, Megan Ellershaw, from Natural England, and Emma Taylor from the Environment Agency, and then last but no means least, James Cook from the Welsh Government. Okay, and you've all got roughly 10 minutes each. And I think we're kind of sticking reasonably well to time, Clifton. Yeah. Okay, so first up, Dave.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone, first of all, and thanks to Stuart for the introduction and to IUCN for the invite today. Like Stuart, I spent a lot of my formative years in the Fens as well, Lincolnshire Fens rather than Cambridgeshire Fens. I hope Stuart's not offended. In fact, my first experience of driving was down a fen road, sort of 15 miles north of Peterborough. That didn't end particularly well, I have to say, but hopefully this presentation will go a bit better than that. And just to thank in advance the team in DAERA and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency who've basically provided the material for this presentation, so to Rennie McEwen, John McKillen and Emma Reeve. I was speaking at the last conference in Aberystwyth, and at that point in time, I think in the Northern Ireland Executive we had a minister still. Those of you who follow politics with any sort of interest will know that we don't, at the moment, currently have a minister, so I'll hopefully give an overview of what we've been doing in those particular circumstances. It might be that you think that Northern Ireland's a bit like a mallard, not really moving around a lot on top of the water, but quite a lot going on underneath, hopefully, in terms of the legs kicking away to try and keep things moving whilst we're in the current political situation. So just quickly looking at the policy landscape, that covers what we're doing in Northern Ireland. There are a number of initiatives there that I think have particular relevance to what we're doing. Perhaps most importantly, the Climate Act for Northern Ireland that was passed last year in 2022. We've been working on the Climate Action Plan to bring into effect the policies needed to meet the targets within that. Obviously, a particular relevance is the land use change and forestry sector. Then underpinning that as well, we have two particularly important strategies, one on green growth, which is an NI executive strategy once adopted, and the environment strategy. So between them, they look at the natural environment and also the linkage between the climate piece, the natural environment biodiversity piece, and also looking for sustainable green jobs, particularly in the green growth strategy. Farming with nature, I'll touch on that a bit in a slide or two. That's the first manifestation of our new agricultural policy, post-CAP. And then on the right-hand side, a couple of more strategies of relevance, obviously when it comes to peatlands and peatland habitats in particular, ammonia emissions and nitrogen deposition are a particular impactor, and we've been working away on strategies to reduce emissions in that area. And then finally, Our nature recovery strategy, NRS, taking on board some of the commitments from COP15 in Montreal, particularly around the 30 by 30 target, obviously of relevance. And I will just mention briefly horticultural peat and some work that we're doing in that sphere as well. So just quickly, an update on the peatland strategy. With the absence of ministers, we've kind of really, I suppose, paused substantive work on signing this off because we need a minister to sign it off in all likelihood, although senior officials are allowed to take decisions in the absence of ministers, but certain things are so significant that it will only be appropriately done by a political representative. So we consulted on the strategy itself in 2021. We did a follow-up consultation on the quality impact assessment. There was particular interest on the differential impact of that on certain groups, so we consulted on that. And really, that's probably where we got in terms of the strategy itself. But we are taking forward some of the business as usual actions that will sit within the strategy once published, and that's probably where I'm going to take you in the rest of the presentation. So first of all, looking at peatland restoration. So what's happening when it comes to practical restoration? We can't move the policy forward because of a lack of ministers in the executive. We can at least start to or continue work on restoration. So we're supporting a number of projects and initiatives, and I'll take you through these in the next few slides. The first one there is our Environment Fund. So this is really looking to scale up, and I suppose that's a theme for Northern Ireland, the need to scale up our restoration. The Committee on Climate Change have given us some advice on the foot of our Climate Act, and basically we know ourselves that we really need to increase the scale of our ambition of restoration, and the Environment Fund is one means of doing that. It's primarily funded by income from our carrier bag levy, actually, and that's an important source of long-term funding for as long as people are not reusing carrier bags. Whilst we wish them to continue to stop using carrier bags, there'll always be a residual usage, which is supporting this fund. We just launched the latest 5-year plan, which probably over those 5 years will come out around 100 million. Not all of that will go to peatland restoration, but there's a very strong focus on nature, climate recovery, and resilience. And so there are a number of projects there, 37, which include peatland projects, which will be funding, probably to the tune of 50 million over the next 5 years. A couple of examples of those that we've been working on. This one is currently ongoing with the RSPB in Northern Ireland on the peatland code. We've been a bit slow, perhaps, to the peatland code party for a number of reasons, which might come out in the discussion. But RSPB have been looking at that in partnership with ourselves and our funding from the Environment Fund and also Northern Ireland Water, the water utility. So we've registered our first 2 sites in Northern Ireland, one on upland in the Garran Plateau in Antrim, and then a lowland raised bog at Wolf Island. And so that's enabled us to start to see how the peatland code might apply in Northern Ireland with its particular geography and land use and land ownership characteristics. The strategic strand, so the Environment Fund has a number of strands. This is the strategic strand. This is really looking at taking forward the large-scale restoration in the Environment Fund. So we have a number of projects within that, which we are funding over the next 5 years. So, for example, Ulster Wildlife will be working on approximately 400 hectares worth of restoration in the next few years, whilst at the same time delivering a pipeline of projects going forward of around 5,000 hectares. So that's really about making a start and then getting a pipeline of sort of shovel-ready projects in train as well. Ulster Wildlife will also be using the funding from the Environment Fund for work on collaborative and technical network, picking up on that capacity and skills piece that's been mentioned by the Minister there earlier on. A couple of other ENGO partners, the Ballinderry Rivers Trust, are working on a results-based pilot scheme on river restoration in the Lough Neagh basin, and also the National Trust looking at some work on novel approaches to peatland restoration. Hopefully all of those contributing to the wider need to meet the CCC's targets going forward. EFS group projects, just a very quick mention of these. The environmental farming scheme is our current agri-environment scheme. The group project is effectively our collaborative approach, where we get farmers to band together in groups via independent facilitators to focus on particular issues. So there's 2 or 3 there, examples: Ulster Wildlife, RSPB and the Loch Ness Partnership are all working on schemes that will have more or less impact on peatland habitat, particularly the Ulster Wildlife project in Fermanagh and Tyrone, and also RSPB working on Glenwerry, the site up in the Antrim Plateau as well. So that's our current agri-environment scheme. I'll touch on the future one in a minute or two. The emissions inventory when it comes to peatlands in Northern Ireland is probably an area where we know we need to do some work to start to look at the science behind that and see whether we can increase the accuracy of that. So we're working in a project called Peak Flux, feeding into the National Carbon Flux Network for peatlands via CEH, and a number of sites we're taking forward there on the screen. Colleagues are going to be speaking about that in the Restoration Trajectories Workshop, day 3, so I don't expect any difficult questions on that in the Q&A, because that will be on day 3. But it is important, all joking aside, you know, we've recognised that you know, the imagery is an important area of science we need to work on, and also just in terms of getting buy-in from stakeholders. Work on another policy area on ammonia has shown that actually being able to show the imagery is accurate does enable you to have a more fruitful discussion with stakeholders and land managers in particular if they believe that the imagery is actually accurate. Okay, that was the sort of practical restoration piece. The policy area and knowledge transfer, I'm just going to pick on 3 or 4 items here just to give you an idea that whilst we have no ministers, we are still working. The Climate Action Plan, the Climate Act has set us some very challenging targets. We are working up a Climate Action Plan which will be covering obviously all of the sectors. The land use change and forestry sector is particularly important. It accounts for 11.2% of emissions in Northern Ireland. It's a net emissions source rather than a sequestration, which obviously is not unique to us, but in terms of the sectoral mix in Northern Ireland, LULUCF and agriculture probably account for 40% of emissions. And so it's important that we work on that. Obviously in terms of LULUCF, it's about increasing forest cover, peatland restoration, and also increasing sequestration through agri-environment schemes. Which takes me on quickly just to the Farming with Nature package. This is just a very quick outline of where we might be going with that. So Farming with Nature will be our new agri-environment scheme. It will have 3 main elements to it. So the one on the left there, looking at intensive areas. So this is the intensive sector, perhaps dairying, maybe less relevant to the peatlands piece, but we're looking there to start work on things like biodiversity audits and then moving perhaps towards results-based payments in that area, starting some pilots in the latter part of this year. The second one there in the red, priority habitats, that will be transiting from our current scheme, EFS, when it comes to high nature value areas and designated areas, at the provision of independent ecological advice to produce a management plan, hopefully then to factor that into the ongoing management of restored sites. And then finally, on the right-hand side, landscape innovation piece. That very much is about third-party delivery, looking to work at a landscape scale to meet some of those strategic objectives I mentioned earlier on around the environment strategy, peatlands, and climate. Very quickly on ammonia, obviously I mentioned earlier on its importance in terms of the impact on peatlands. In the last 12 months we've consulted on an ammonia strategy which aims to have an ambitious verifiable reduction programme at both at the Northern Ireland level with some Northern Ireland policy initiatives, but also working at a spatially targeted approach around our key designated sites as well. We have a particular issue on our planning when it comes to agricultural development and potential impacts on designated sites via ammonia emissions. And so we have the Environment Agency has an operational protocol to enable them to assess the impacts of air pollution on the environment. And we've been doing some work there, issuing a call for evidence to help support an update on that to make sure it's both scientifically and legally robust. Just a couple minutes, maybe less on horticultural peat and the knowledge transfer piece. Within Northern Ireland, we were fortunate to have a College of Agriculture, Food and Rural Enterprise, CAFRE, which is part of the DAERA family. And so they've been working facilitating the transition towards peat-free production, agricultural plants and trees, hosting technical workshops for growers, assessing peat-free growing media. So there's the picture there, I think, shows a contrast between ornamentals grown in peat and peat-free. I can't remember which one's which. You'll have to tell me on that one. The one that's doing well is the peat-free, obviously. So that's probably something we have in Northern Ireland, which we probably need to make more use of, actually, that link between the policy and the knowledge transfer. So that's something, and we've got, I think, a colleague from CAFRE here, Brian, who might be able to give you some more information on it if you want. I'd mentioned the funding from our Environment Fund. There are also external sources of funding. The unique political circumstances in Northern Ireland mean that as part of the EU exit deal, we still have access to EU funding for certain things, taking forward our structural funds Interreg into a program that's called Peace Plus. This is one that's really for funding of projects in the border counties of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and you can see there's a number of different pillars to that. The theme 5, which is the biodiversity, nature, recovery, resilience, probably will have a budget of around 40 million over the next few years, and certainly that is an area where we're working very strongly with colleagues in Ireland to look at factoring in peatland restoration there. And then finally, in funding terms, also the Shared Island Fund, which is an initiative from the Irish Government, but also with the Scottish Government and ourselves, again looking to put in £20 million over the next few years, with contributions from Nature Scot and the Environment Agencies in Northern Ireland, led by the National Parks and Wildlife Service in Ireland, and again, a good opportunity there for peatland restoration. Just finally, I suppose, to look at the private finance piece. We're late to the party on this, and have to acknowledge colleague John McKillen, who's done some important work really as part of some work he's been doing, looking at surveying stakeholder attitudes in Northern Ireland and the wider UK and Ireland, but particularly looking at what the barriers might be to private finance in peatland restoration in Northern Ireland. We're currently looking at the results of those surveys and then looking to take forward what we call a strategic insight lab, which is a facility we have in the Northern Ireland Government to take forward public sector innovation and to bring players in to have a sort of a bespoke workshop to really do a deep dive looking at how we might factor in private finance to recognise the unique circumstances in Northern Ireland. And so that's something we are taking forward, and I'm sure John, who is here, I think, will be pleased to chat to you on about that over the next couple of days. So just, in conclusion, the final slide then, I suppose broadly where we're at in Northern Ireland, in the absence of ministers, we're still working on our peatland strategy, the implementation plan, and taking forward projects so we have political cover from the former minister. We are developing the funding for a restoration programme, the boring nuts and bolts that need doing in terms of business plan development and political engagement. And although we have no executive, the political parties are engaged in the background on some of these key strategic initiatives that might come into place once an executive does reform. And climate is increasingly, one of the key areas of a future programme for government in Northern Ireland around people, planet, prosperity. And so the work on peatlands is of interest to the political class, even in the absence of a functioning executive. So we're looking to get in place the building blocks to enable them to take that forward when they come back. Capacity building is important for us, as it is for all UK administrations, and we have been chatting across administrations around that piece to see where we can share, and obviously continue to build the evidence base, which supports policy and practical work as well. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully I haven't run over too much, and thanks for your time.
Well, hello. I'm really pleased to be here with you today in Ely at the IUCN UK Peatland Programme Conference. Last year at this conference in Wales, my colleague Ben Dipper put a spotlight on Scotland's peatland restoration work and challenges to upscaling our restoration rates. And I'm thrilled that the conversation continues today with a focus on peatland restoration, conservation, management, and strategic alignment with land use, forestry, and development policy in Scotland. I'm Claire McFadden. I'm currently the peatland policy lead at the Scottish Government. I completed my MSc in Biodiversity Conservation and Management, which I'm now using to inform my country's peatland restoration, conservation, and management efforts. I should really say my adopted countries. I grew up in the southern portion of the US state of New Jersey, next to a very different type of wetland habitat. Our coastal wetlands protected my family home from the destructive power of hurricanes that occasionally visited our shores. Year after year, I could see firsthand the ecosystem service value that these coastal wetlands provided. In Scotland, we are seeing the direct consequences of failing to protect our peatlands. While not protecting us from hurricanes, our peatlands in Scotland play a significant role in mitigating climate change by acting as carbon sinks. However, as it's been said, when peatlands are drained for agriculture or disturbed for peat extraction, the stored carbon is released back into the atmosphere, further contributing to global warming. It is estimated that around 3/4 of Scotland's peatlands are degraded, and these degraded peatlands have been estimated to account for as much as 14 to 15% of Scotland's total gross annual carbon emissions. A drained peatland is a loss of unique habitat, biodiversity, ecosystem services, and also an emission source that not only threatens our local ecosystems, but also has global repercussions. Reversing degradation through peatland restoration is central to mitigating and adapting to the linked climate change and nature crises. Just to touch back on peatland restoration, in Scotland, we've committed £250 million to restoring 250,000 hectares of degraded peatlands by 2030. The First Minister's policy prospectus, which was published in April of 2023, promises to deliver up to 110,000 hectares of restored peatlands by 2026. From 1990 to 2020, the average annual restoration rate has been about 1,500 hectares. However, since 2020, this annual average has risen fourfold to 6,000 hectares. In 22-23, we restored about 7,500 hectares, and in 23-24, we plan to restore about 10,700 hectares. This upward trend is encouraging and evidence that we are putting the right building blocks in place and are beginning to see some positive results. We know, however, we must go further to secure the change needed in restoration rates to allow our peatlands to play their full part in our journey to net zero and meeting the targets we have set out in the climate change plan. Our goal to restore this 250,000 hectares of degraded peatland by 2030 is undoubtedly challenging on a number of fronts, and we are working on a number of focus areas. This includes increasing contractor capacity to facilitate delivery, progressing essential scientific research to inform decision-making, and attracting private investment in peatland restoration and management. Work on all of these fronts will be vital if we are to transform delivery to meet our 2030 target. Alongside restoration, we're working to improve the conservation and management of our peatlands. We're working to protect peatlands from damage caused by extraction, development, and various land use practices. Through sustainable and adaptive management, we aim to maintain and enhance rural livelihoods and maximize site-adapted land use. Some highlights include that we've committed to ending the use of peat in horticulture. Our public consultation on ending the sale of peat in Scotland closed in May of 2023, and we were pleased to receive over 500 responses, which we're now reviewing to inform the scope and timing of the ban. Through our national planning framework, we have strengthened the controls on future extraction and on other types of development on peat. The Wildlife Management and Muir Burn Bill was introduced in March of 2023 and sets out conditions under which muir burn is permitted with tighter regulations where it is carried out on peatlands. We remain committed to aligning with or even exceeding EU laws and standards where we can. We have agreed in principle to take forward the new Good Agriculture and Environment condition covering the protection of wetlands and peatlands, weaving the care of these important habitats right through future rural support. So I was asked to specifically hone in on 3 areas, and one of them was land use. So through Scotland's third land use strategy, which was published in March 2021, the Scottish Government sets out a long-term vision and objectives for sustainable land use. The strategy focuses on integrated land use, using a new landscape scale approach to showcase the range of demands and benefits we get from our land. It is through understanding these multiple and sometimes conflicting relationships that we can look to secure the balance that will be needed to allow our land to contribute sustainably to our multiple long-term national priorities. The challenges of climate change and the biodiversity crises mean that land usage will change in parts of Scotland, either enforced by the impacts of climate change or to mitigate and protect against these impacts. This will mean change for many of our stewards of the landscape, farmers, landowners. The Scottish Government is committed to ensuring that rural incomes and the vitality of rural communities will be maintained, but wherever possible, enhanced. While some practices will become less attractive, new activities and income streams, such as peatland restoration and support through the forestry grant scheme, are already becoming available. The Scottish Government's Vision for Agriculture, which was published in March of 2022, outlines our aim to transform how we support farming and food production in Scotland to become a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture. The recently updated route map illustrates how we will deliver on this vision for agriculture, and this includes confirmation of the introduction of new protections for peatlands and wetlands as a condition on basic payments from 2025. Second area I was asked to look at was forestry. So as some background, we do not support the planting of trees on deep peat, which is over 50 centimeters, or on sites that would compromise the hydrology of adjacent wetland habitats. This would not meet the UKFS requirements and would therefore not be eligible for forestry grant scheme funding. In Scotland, decisions on replanting a previously afforested deep peat site are taken on a site-by-site basis according to guidance. This guidance sets out a list of sites where there is a presumption to restore the site. In these circumstances, restocking will not be included under felling permission conditions. The Scottish Government supports woodland creation and forest management through the forestry grant scheme, and support will only be granted where UKFS requirements are met and where we are confident that the site is suitable for trees being planted. This helps us ensure our natural environment is both protected and enhanced. And last area of focus for this brief talk is on onshore electricity generation. Peatlands and the expansion of onshore wind renewables in Scotland highlight the complexities of environmental stewardship and energy transition. As we strive to restore degraded peatlands and meet the Scottish Government's ambitious targets to restore 250,000 hectares by 2030, we recognize the immense value of these ecosystems in terms of carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, and climate regulation. Simultaneously, there is a need to scale up renewable energy sources to meet Scotland's equally ambitious target to have 20 gigawatts of installed onshore wind capacity by 2030. This interplay prompts us to navigate a path forward that harmonizes the imperatives of peatland restoration and renewable energy development, requiring innovative solutions, planning coordination, and a shared focus on sustainability. The Scottish Government recognizes that the impacts of onshore wind farms on peatlands can be significant. We must balance the benefits from onshore wind deployment and the impacts on our carbon-rich habitats. This includes being aware that there is potential for development in an area of deep peat to have a net negative carbon impact. Work is underway to assess the operation of, and if necessary, update or replace the carbon calculator planning permission tool. The Scottish Government will ensure that adequate tools and guidance are available to inform the assessment of net carbon impacts of development proposals on peatlands and other carbon-rich soils. We have also convened an expert peatland group, including representatives from industry, agencies, and academia. This will provide advice to the Scottish Government on how guidance could be developed to support both our peatlands and onshore wind aims. So these considerations are only some of the complexities and challenges in peatland policy making in Scotland. But with every challenge comes an opportunity, the opportunity to innovate, to collaborate, and to find novel solutions that serve both people and nature. I very much look forward to hearing from the other speakers today and to conversations to come. Please feel free to get in touch, and thank you so much for your time today.
So yes, welcome to the England presentation, which features me from DEFRA, Megan from Natural England, and Emma from the Environment Agency. And we work together to deliver the England Peat Action Plan. Within DEFRA, we actually have 3 policy teams focusing on restoration, protection, and a new one on lowland agricultural peat. I head up this Lowland team, and I'll focus on the steps we've taken this year before I'll pass over to Megan and Emma to hear about our wider progress on delivery. So, what's new in the Lowlands? This year, we published the report of the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force, which DEFRA originally commissioned to develop recommendations around more sustainable management regimes. This is because while our lowland peat soils produce highly profitable agriculture, draining them is responsible for 88% of all England's greenhouse gas emissions from peat. The task force chair, Robert Caldwell, produced 14 recommendations which he grouped into the 4 themes you see here: addressing challenges associated with water, enabling more sustainable forms of agriculture, supporting people, partnerships and economies, and driving forward science and innovation, which means things like field trials, technology and pluviculture. By way of response, as we heard earlier, DEFRA ministers have stated that the government will take forward action on all recommendations, and more specifically, we agree with the report's overarching conclusion that if we are to preserve lowland peat soils, then we must implement changes centred on water. This will, of course, be a long journey, and there is much that we don't yet know. For now, we're investing some £30 million in pilot projects, which I'll discuss in a moment. We're also developing our evidence base. For example, the Lowland Peat R&D project will improve our understanding of the challenges of topography, food security, and water availability. And we've sought to support farmers and land managers through ELMS payments for raising water tables, as well as the update to the peatland code. In the longer term, we intend to scale up towards Robert Caldwell's vision of investing in water storage, telemetry, and water level management infrastructure, alongside technical advice and incentives for sustainable agriculture. We'll keep you updated as we progress. Turning to our pilots, we have the Pluviculture Exploration Fund, which seeks to address barriers to commercial pluviculture, the Water Discovery Pilot, facilitating local collaboration around developing water management plans, and the Small Infrastructure Pilot, supporting early steps on the ground to enable higher water levels. A driving principle across all 3 is that we need to support and learn with our delivery partners, farmers, land managers, and internal drainage boards, as we undertake this ambitious agricultural transition. What we expect to learn will help develop our future work, such as how local groups can best collaborate and what long-term costs might be. Ultimately, the most important thing will be the barriers we identify at this stage so that we can adapt our approach as we scale up. So thanks for listening, and I'll now pass over to Megan to discuss our ambitions for restoration delivery.
Thank you. So I'm going to give a bit of an update from Natural England in terms of delivery. So as we've already mentioned, the England Peatland Action Plan provides the framework for the ambition for what we want to do in terms of restoration. And I'm just going to pick out a few key things where we've got significant progress over the last year. So we've got the Peatland Restoration Roadmap. This provides a pipeline of delivery. We want to get to 280,000 hectares by 2050. So this is about how we're going to do it. There's a workshop later in the week, so I won't go into any detail, but it's looking at, in terms of trajectories, what we need to do. Then we've got closely linked to that is the England Peatland Map. So this is a model of extent, condition and depth of peat models using existing, new and different types of data sources. It's expected to deliver by March 2025. There's also going to be a restoration register led by DEFRA, which is tracking what restoration we're doing. So this is running a little bit behind, but the ambition is very much still there. Then we've got the capital funding under the Native Climate Scheme, which I'll come on to in a little bit and talk more later. So we've got the Native Climate Peatland Grant Scheme, and we've got the Pluviculture Exploration Fund. And then underpinning all of that, we're developing a monitoring strategy to take us to run alongside that ambition of restoration until 2050. So in terms of restoration, we also have an advisory role. So some of the highlights of what we've done in the last year in terms of supporting the restoration community. Currently, there's a review of some of the published evidence on heather and grass management, so that's work that's underway. In support of both aligning the trees and peat action plans, there's been new revised guidance joint between Natural England and Forestry Commission on tree planting and on waders. So that's updated a decision-making framework about peat that we're looking at replanting of trees. Then we've also got the suite of guidance that we've produced alongside the grant scheme. So these are standalone documents that we're looking to carry on and evolve so that it's a legacy of the grant scheme. So that's work underway. And just picking one of those, particularly in the historic environment, we've produced a toolkit for contractors. It's a very accessible YouTube video and what you should be doing in terms of looking at archaeology when you're thinking about peatland restoration. So moving to restoration delivery, what we're actually doing. So a big chunk of what we do in Natural England is the grant scheme. So it's a 4-year grant scheme. It's only ever intended as a stopgap between what comes next. So we are currently at 2.78 megatons of carbon target secured, 22,000 hectares through the grant scheme with an additional 6,000 through other projects. At the moment, we've got a total of 23 projects, restoration projects. We had 16 more coming in, 12 new this year, as the Minister suggested. We also had 15 discovery projects. These were planning projects which we hoped would lead into restoration projects. Those have now completed, and we're expecting the final reports of those by the end of this year. Alongside this, we've got the Pludiculture Exploration Fund. I won't say anything about the projects because the Minister covered that already, but this is a project it's not only about project funding, but there's also in developing a community of interest. There's a very good independent website developing, which is going to be intended to be community supported, and that's producing some really interesting things. So lots of good information, a plug for the website, go and have a look. And then other restoration that we're involved with, so through our own the National Nature Reserve estate, we're actually managing a lot of peatlands. So just to give you a flavour, we've got, for example, Moorhouse, a 7,000 plus hectare site in the upland. We've got 10 NRs which are focused on lowland raised bog, and there's multiple fen communities. So there's a lot of delivery within the estate that we own, and then other projects like Waterlands, which is a Horizon 2020 project that's with the Great North Bog and Leeds University as partners. So that's what's happened. So in terms of thinking about what next, so just to give you a flavour of where we as an organisation are thinking, so our main focus is looking at the grant scheme. So it is only ever a finite project. It's due to end in March 2025, so we're looking at that transition. We've learned a lot in running a grant scheme, so we're spending a lot of time now looking at how we can share that learning. So it's not just about actual restoration delivery, but in terms of actually running a grant scheme, what have we learned, what are the barriers and what are the challenges, and how can we help whatever comes next. So that's one focus. The environmental land management scheme, as we've already talked about, that's the next step from our grant scheme in terms of government-funded projects. So we're looking at the peat offer that's coming through that and working with colleagues in DEFRA, sharing our experience in terms of a delivery body. So we're continuing to look at growing private investment and longer-term security. So the intention is that there will be less reliance on government funding. So we're continuing to work with people like the Peatland Code, which is the government-backed supported scheme, to look at how we can do that. We know that increasing sector capacity is one of the things. We've learnt that through the grant scheme. And we know that there's lots more that's needed to do. So in response to this, there's a cross DEFRA body working group, and recently they've launched an 18-month research project to look into what can be done. And one of those, the work packages of the 5 work packages, is specifically focused on lowland. We're also looking at Pludiculture, so building on what we're doing through Pludiculture Exploration Fund. We know this is a growing area. There's lots of support. We know it's an area that there's lots more that could be done. It's very exciting. So it's one of the things that we're looking at. So what could we do? Is there a PEF Mark II? Whatever. So that's kind of just a flavour of some of the things that we're looking at. What we do know is that there's lots of restoration that still needs to happen. So it's trying to continue the momentum of that. And so I'll pause there and I will pass to Emma to give the Environment Agency perspective.
Thank you very much. I'm here today to give the EA update on behalf of Catherine Birdsall, who unfortunately can't be with us today. The EA peatland team may only be just over a year old, but the value that peatlands have, healthy peatlands have on our water environment has long been recognised by the EA, primarily through flood defence and water quality funding. Our area teams over the last 10 years have supported over 12,500 hectares of blanket bog restoration and smaller amounts of lowland raised bog and fen restoration. The last 10 years has also seen rapid development in peatland policy and funding opportunities. The update you've just got from Chris and Megan gives you an idea of what's going on now. But the future, or what the future looks like in terms of funding and ongoing management, is really important. The EA, alongside NE, administer the ELM landscape recovery projects. 5 of these EA-led catchment-wide landscape-scale multi-landowner projects include peatland restoration, and there's a mix of upland and lowland in there. And it will be exciting to see how these projects develop over the next 18 months to 2 years. Over the last 12 months, we have supported evidence gathering on water quality information, water flow information, and looking at novel technology for planning and monitoring restoration over separate projects. The England Peat Action Plan supports an increase in restoration, but it also introduces the new concept of reducing degradation through sustainable soil management, primarily by raising the water table in lowland agricultural peat areas. What does this look like in reality? Well, that's a big question, isn't it? One size fits all is not likely to work. It's likely to be a mosaic approach where with wetter farming, paludiculture, space for food production, and where possible, restoration. Lowland agricultural peat areas tend to be found in highly managed water areas, often with complex infrastructure. Now, the EA is looking to gather more information around the impact of raising the water table on flood risk, infrastructure requirements, water resource demand, and water quality. And a couple of ways of doing this, as Chris mentioned, the EA are running a lowland agricultural peat water discovery pilot. The funding is aimed at developing water management plans and costings, what's needed to deliver and raising the water table on the ground and better inform that. Alongside that, the EA also have a lowland agricultural peat research and development stream, and this is looking at some of those questions around the water environment. And we'll be holding a workshop on Thursday to explore those themes in more detail and look at the challenges. So we're 3 organisations, DEFRA, Natural England and the EA, with different remits, but we're working under one family umbrella to deliver the England Peat Action Plan. So thank you.
Bryn Houndar, good afternoon conference. My name's James Cook and I'm the Welsh Government lead for peatland restoration. And just like to say, this presentation has been prepared with Dr. Peter Jones and Hannah Hughes from NRW and our National Peatland Action Programme team. The IUCN suggested that the Wales Country Update should focus on the 30 by 30 biodiversity commitment and our work on some of our protected sites. My colleague Pete Jones always reminds audiences that the climate and nature emergencies are inextricably linked, and that whilst much of what we do as government is driven by decarbonisation, as we've heard a lot about already today, biodiversity is equally as important in the case for peatland restoration. So it's fab to be here today to talk about that particular aspect in Wales. At last year's conference, Julie James, my the Minister for Climate Change, was able to announce a tripling of the peatland restoration target and plans to upscale delivery. And these plans were largely driven by our response to the United Nations 30 by 30 goal, which aims to protect and effectively manage 30% of the planet's marine and 30% of the planet's terrestrial environment by 2030. And the response in Wales was led by what we call the deep dive, biodiversity deep dive process, commissioned by the Welsh Government to assess how nature recovery across land and sea can best be accelerated. And out of that process came a series of recommendations with peatland restoration front and centre. Now, there's a whole host of recommendations and enabling actions and aspirations as part of this, and far too many to go into. But what I like about the deep dive process is the integration and relevance to peatlands. And whilst we have the headline news of increasing peatland delivery, something we all love to hear, there are a series of enablers and foundation stones which also require action to achieve our PT objectives. And this slide is far too busy, and there is too much text, but I hope it demonstrates the breadth of ambition and action by Welsh Government, NRW and its partners through this 30 by 30 process. So apart from increasing peatland restoration delivery, in this long list we have a renewed focus on protected sites with everything from protection, management, monitoring and designation. We have a focus to improve the effectiveness of protection from damaging impacts. We also have more priority given to strengthening policy in the planning system. We've got the Sustainable Farming Scheme, hopefully coming online in 18 months' time. And we have a significant body of work ongoing over private finance and the development of statutory nature recovery targets. All of this adds a considerable body of weight to the case for peatland protection and the ongoing sustainable management of peatlands, all driven by this 30 by 30 commitment. Whilst NRW through the National Peatland Action Programme provide the operational lead, my role is to ensure that peatlands are embedded in each of these work streams to make the links and continue to make the case. The priority given to peatlands is reflected in the budget process, and it's probably fair to say that Welsh Government is facing one of its most difficult financial periods that I've certainly experienced in my career. But ministers continue to support delivery because of the peatlands' dual relevance to nature and decarbonisation, and as we quite often hear at conferences, the Cinderella story. So, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the upscale plans, the deep dive recommendations, the actions all place Wales in an optimistic position to meet the Global Biodiversity Framework goals of placing 30% of degraded peatland ecosystems under effective restoration management. The estimate for action by 2030, which is on the right-hand side there, circa about 22,000 hectares, does not include the Sustainable Farming Scheme estimates and its predecessor schemes, notably Glasstier. So hopefully we will exceed this particular target. And the National Peatland Action Programme itself will account for over half of the delivery, with the remainder coming from existing NRW mechanisms. This slide shows the work undertaken last season, and clearly there's a strong crossover with designated sites. Nearly 52% of Wales's peatlands are already designated, and the upscale plans, the deep dive recommendations, and those actions in the deep dive process place Wales in a very strong position, not only to meet this particular target, but to continue to exceed it. And we also have monitoring. Monitoring is extremely important, and I think I'll probably be fair to say that monitoring wasn't one of our priorities when we started the peatland upscale process. It was about delivery, delivery, delivery. But monitoring now is coming to the forefront of our minds. And really, this year, last year, this year, next year, is all about setting the habitat baseline condition. And next year, we also move into then the hydrological baseline condition as well. So, just a few case studies, hopefully, and if I can find myself, my place in my notes. In terms of direct delivery funded by the National Peatland Programme, this is one of the highest priority designated sites within it for NRW to work on. Much of Fig and Blind Brevi is designated as a SSSI and has historically been managed as open land within the Welsh Government woodland estate. This site is in unfavourable condition caused by historic peatland erosion and the northeast of the site by Ismalinia dominant. The works delivered as part of this contract focus on the hydrological restoration, including the construction of a range of contour bunds and dams. And the figures in the top right of the screen illustrate the scale of intervention on this particular site. And just sticking with this site, the upper image dated 2021 shows the historic erosion prior to rewetting. with the approximate height of the hags between 30 and 70 centimetres. And of course then the lower, dated 2022, September 22, follows the installation of all those standard peat dams and low peat dams between the hags to reduce the water loss and increase the mosaic of terrestrial bog and pool habitats. A water vole species licence was required in order to undertake these works, and mitigation measures included scheme design modification, the phasing of works, avoidance of locations, and on-site contractor training. The recent RSPB et al. State of Nature report highlighted that mammals show a long-term decline in average abundance over the last 25 years. With the average change for some species like water vole, this has declined dramatically. Water voles are Wales's rarest mammal and are thought to be at risk of extinction in 30 years unless work is undertaken to reverse their decline. An example of one of the many species that will benefit hugely from peatland restoration. This site in particular, Carnfleur, is only a short distance from the previous example I've just shown you. It's up in the Towie Forest, which some of you will have visited at last year's IUCN conference in Aberystwyth. These photos were taken circa 12 months on from the completion of works, and you can see the sphagnum recolonisation already. And it's now in the second year of recovery, and anecdotally, the local peatland team report an abundance of water vole activity. Water vole activity was not recorded at this site before restoration work, so NPAP appear to have enabled colonisation, and a new site to be added to the overall metapopulation is an important step in these upland areas. And it's very much hoped that it's only a matter of time before the recently restored site that you've previously seen at Figenbrine Brevi shows the same level of activity. And just Pete Jones in the middle there, I've never seen anybody run across a peat dam so fast. We almost lost our Director for Environment in that particular bund and pool, which would have meant an end to all peatland restoration in Wales and an ongoing protracted inquiry. The last site I just wanted to quickly show you was Llyngoras Central. Again, the next site on from the previous two I've showed you. In the middle of the photo, you're able to see water being retained, and all the photos I've showed you were taken in extremely dry spells over the last couple of years. You can see the sphagnum recolonisation and start to get a sense of the network of sites in that upland area around that particular triple SI. So the actions following from the biodiversity deep dive are essential really in providing a landscape scale approach to addressing the 30 by 30 commitment. And in the context of these dry spells, it might be worth noting that we might have expected enhanced failure of some of the bunds, given that they're only installed a short time before, and that we've observed only minimal failure is very encouraging and vindicates the commitment to best practice in design by the National Peatland Action Programme and implementation by our contractors and partners. So I just wanted to finish by saying that a case study, I believe, will soon be forthcoming on the Towie Forest area, including some of these sites that I've highlighted today, and that will be coming to the IUCN website shortly. So please keep an eye out for that. I just want to say a massive thank you, as always, to our partners, where the bulk of the contribution for peatland action comes from. And without you, we can't deliver against our peatland biodiversity and carbon objectives. And I hope that provides an overview of our approach in Wales to the 30 by 30 commitment and the value we place as a peatland team into that process in delivering our objectives. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's question time. Who wants to kick us off? Don't be shy. So if you just want to introduce yourself, and there should be a microphone, and then just say your questions too.
Hello. Great. I'm Louise. I work for Natural England. I've got a question for probably DEFRA, but you know, anyone who's got any thoughts on this. So obviously we've had the Lowland Agricultural Task Force report out and a lot of recommendations in that. Down in Somerset, we've been having a lot of conversations around this, and the the Internal Drainage Board have told us they will not be reviewing their water level management plans. They don't see the report recommendations as a sort of ask to change how they're looking at those, the plans, which obviously is a bit of a blocker in getting any change. And I was wondering if there is conversations around, reviewing those kind of more... But the way they said it is they haven't had any ask from government to change their purpose. So, yeah, just wondering thoughts on that and if there's conversations around any more kind of legal asks for the drainage boards, I suppose.
Thank you. Excellent question and something very much on our minds. So I guess two things. It is one of Robert's recommendations to look into legislation around internal drainage boards. What we're currently doing is gathering evidence through two of the pilots. The local collaboration pilot is going to ask local groups, what do you need? And as I flagged up in the presentation, what are the barriers? The barriers may well be the internal drainage board. And we'll need to work on that potentially around, in the medium term, thinking about what that means for legislation. And then there's the infrastructure pilot that is targeted specifically at internal drainage boards. And one of the things I had on my last slide was sort of testing appetite, basically. And we're looking at what drainage boards around the country are doing. We know some of them are comfortable with raising water levels at the moment. Let's see what happens with the applications, and let's see how, when some drainage boards start to take action on a government-approved project, whether others will sort of start to pick up that message. That runs for until March 2025. So yeah, we don't have all the answers. We know there are particular challenges in Somerset. We work closely with FWAG there. But yes, thank you. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good start. I think the lady was first with a hand up, and then the gentleman in front on the left.
Thank you. Andrea Kelly, Broads Authority. So last week we held a meeting with farmers in the Broads, and they're very happy to work with us regards to the water level management plan because they want to be in the room. So, happy to make changes. That's a long way down the road. We're talking about people's livelihoods. They're not going to sign up to anything. However, in the Broads landscape, we've got a very extensive system of grassland, dominant over our 2,500 hectares of drained peatland. It's on grass, it's extensive, it doesn't have the risks that I heard Emma talk about regarding the Environment Agency's sort of research programme. So I think we're in a space of actually no regret water table change if we want to restore that peat to something that's not emitting carbon. And we need the regulation to support that. We want to work with the food growing farmers to store and hold the water. We want to alleviate our flooding. We want to store, create those opportunities. So we see it as very positive, but it's the water licensing that's holding us back.
So is that a question in there?
It's more of a comment. And so I suppose I see a lot of funding from the Environment Agency going into answering questions that I do not see as priorities as we move forward. I think these things are not issues for our area, but I see a big issue regards the regulation. I believe we need a fundamental rethink of how we manage our water in these water-stressed areas, particularly those that are connected to the coast.
Yeah, okay, good, that's fine. I think comments are good, by the way, so, and people can react or respond to comments.
Yeah,
We've got tomorrow, haven't we, to talk in
yeah, absolutely. But I just wanted to say we are aware of the risk in some of the barriers around the permitting system, and we are working behind the scenes to, on both sides, working with our permitting colleagues and working to make the applicant's journey smoother as well. Some of the, if we take our water resources permits, for example, they've got to balance water demand as well as sort of biological life left in the river. And then we're asking a new question here. So we are looking to, working on both sides.
Okay.
We do appreciate that. And, if you think about where we've come from, where we're going now, I think we've, just looking at all your presentations, we've made a huge step change. So you know, it's just looking at the next challenge and gathering ourselves together on that challenge.
And one comment I would make if I could. So there's a lot of political support and will that's been garnered really over the last decade. Plans are in place, progress is being made, innovation is happening. And I just would like to ask you all to respond, but maybe at the end, just give you a bit of time to think about it. So is there anything really, so my other observation is that I think on our current trajectories, we're not going to hit the targets, both in terms of the UK strategy, climate change committee targets on emissions. So is there anything really that you need from this peatland community to help you accelerate implementation of both your own plans, but also towards those UK targets that we're working towards in terms of 2040 and 2050? Okay, so maybe just have a think about that and we'll come back to that. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. My name is Max. I'm from ECHO. I'm visiting you guys from Germany. And I have a question whether it's allowed in the UK to combine agri-environmental schemes together with the peatland carbon program of IUCN.
Okay, so maybe, yeah.
I'll just respond a little bit from some of our work within Scotland. I think it's a really interesting question. We're currently looking to revamp our agricultural subsidies program and looking at very much incorporating environmental stewardship at the fore, and this has sort of been shared in the public domain. I can't say for certain where this is sort of heading, but we are certainly looking to ensure that there is no conflict between accessing, for example, peatland restoration funding and agricultural subsidies, or you know, being recognized within the peatland code as well. So we're looking to make sure that all of these pieces link together seamlessly. That's sort of our ideal, you know, where we'd like to go trajectory. So from our point of view, we're very much trying to make sure these different components are linked together as best we can.
Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, I suppose it would be similar for the Northern Ireland perspective, maybe not quite as far down the road. As I said in the presentation, we're probably on the peatland code and private finance, we're still sort of kind of the exploratory area. But in terms of the future agricultural policy and the need to link, you know, payments to support good land management over peat on restored peatland, link that into accessing the funding for restoration, you know, that's something we're thinking about. Maybe from the other way around in terms of, you know, the land managers will want to know that they've got a long-term viable option for managing their land once it's restored. And so without at least a signposting of what future policy might look like that in that respect, you know, it will make the restoration, the capital restoration, even that terms, a harder ask.
Yeah, but I think that's a critical thing, isn't it? Because I think we've been very good at realising resources for capital restoration works. It's the kind of ongoing payments that farmers have been used to, really. James, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's
Welsh perspective.
The sustainable farming scheme will be consulted on, I think, towards December, if not January. And that will set out what we're calling the universal actions for Wales, the lowest tier, and what we expect. And the representations we've been putting forward as a team is that peatland restoration is specialist, and the focus needs to be given that. Proper support needs to be given to those organisations, partners, farmers who are dealing with restoration, so we'll probably keep that quite separate. And then the ongoing sustainable management, like we've all said, is then critical, and there's a massive role then for the new subsidy system, the replacement of the cap system, to help play in delivering that, given that in Wales 90% of our peatlands are agriculturally managed. So there's a huge role for farmers to play in ongoing peatland management and recovery, and maintenance for that matter.
Yeah, okay. Is there anything you wanted to add, or?
I don't actually work on this, but the DEFRA team who do are seated in the row behind you and will give you a full answer.
I wish I had that.
Thank you, Amy.
Okay. Was that you, Rob, at the back? Can't quite see you.
Thank you. I mean, amazing progress. You know, this IUCN, sorry, I should say, Rob Stoneman, Vice Chair of this programme and Director of Landscape Recovery at the Wildlife Trust. But yeah, just to say, you know, if you go back to 2008 when this programme started, the progress on peatland restoration is really incredible. You know, so we should be very pleased with ourselves. That said, if I'm reading the if I'm reading Indra's speech properly, which talks about a 40% decrease in emissions by 2050, the first question is that enough? Because we've got to get to zero. And so 40% seems too little, but I think I'm misreading it. And then the second question that relates to that for the agencies is, are the restoration targets, I mean, are we on track, even with the 250 million here, there, splashed around and so on, are we on track to meet even those, I think, quite conservative targets from the Climate Change Committee?
Well, there you go. There's the kind of nub of it. I did a little calculation. I know what I think, but where do we want to start? Indra, did you want to kind of respond in terms of the ambition of the Climate Change Committee
it's important
first?
to note that the net zero ambition is economy-wide, so we're not saying that in each individual sector, whether it's agriculture, transport, energy, they've all got to individually reach net zero, so it's across the economy. So the position is that for some sectors like agriculture, you can't bring emissions down to zero as long as you're farming, you know, whether you've got cattle or growing sheep. So we need to get to as low as we can, and for those sectors that still continue to emit, we need to increase our carbon sink to offset. So the net position is it's a net zero across the economy. So peatlands can be a source of emissions, assuming that everything else decarbonises as much as possible. But that's not to say we can't be more ambitious, you know, going forward. And in 7th Carbon Budget, we'll obviously be looking at that, whether we can go further.
Yeah, so that was kind of 80% of degraded peatland,
yes,
kind of baked into the target. Okay, Claire, could we come to you first? You kind of, I think you've set out some numbers in the narrative of your presentation there.
Yeah, certainly. Again, as I said in my presentation, our targets within Scotland are ambitious, and our progress to date has not matched that level that we'd like to achieve. Again, I think we have the building blocks in place to sort of accelerate this restoration in particular. It is a relatively young industry itself. That being said, we're also investigating, to go along with increasing this sort of upscaling of restoration, how we can gain emission savings elsewhere through that active management element, through that sort of conservation element, through our peatland sales ban. We're trying to look at a broader lens of reduction in emissions beyond just restoration. So that's sort of our current focus areas. But again, I think we've got a team working hard away. We've got funding in place, and we're just trying to make the right links to continue to accelerate.
But there's an acceptance that we have to. Yeah.
We certainly have to. As I said in my presentation, we definitely need to accelerate to meet our ambition. I laid out the current trajectory, the past trajectories, and we've got some work to do.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's a similar question that I presented a little bit earlier on, so maybe just come to each of you then in turn, and if you want to kind of respond to mine and Rob's point. So what is it that we can also help you with in terms of making that acceleration and upscaling? James, we come to you next.
Yeah, I guess I wonder what the ultimate driver for peatland restoration should be. If we're looking at decarbonisation, well, we're looking at 37%, aren't we, or thereabouts, 40%. And that seems historically to have set a lot of the trajectory. But if you're looking at adaptation, then I think Indra touched on it in her presentation earlier. What do we need to do for peatlands as an ecosystem to ensure that it survives, given the climate change that we are likely to experience moving forward? So I think there's probably a wider question on what we need to do there, and really what our primary driver should be. I think in Wales we are, the scale of the challenge is a lot different to my colleagues here. We're talking about 90,000 hectares of peatland, and we think that the upscale plan we announced last year will deliver the 40% or 37% emission reductions that we have committed to. So we believe that it will deliver that. And I think that we're also in a fortunate position in that we've got a hugely experienced LIFE team who are here today, and we've got a hugely experienced now National People in Action team, even though they've only been going for 3.5 seasons, to give that firm foundation for us to build on in future. And we've got a plan on how we're going to upscale it. We've got funding coming in to be able to do that, and I'm confident that we'll be able to reach our target. I think what we probably, what we need help with, we probably need help with everything. I think I need help in getting a bigger team together, because I'm very envious of all my colleagues who've got huge investment in their government teams. But really, it's about everybody with an interest contributing to the Sustainable Farming Scheme consultation that's coming up in December, because it's that ongoing management piece that is also going to provide not only our decarbonisation objectives, but our biodiversity objectives, and making sure those peatlands are in the best condition they can be moving forward before we can do maybe some of the more harder interventions that we need.
Dave?
Yeah, I mean, the scale of the challenge is significant first in Northern Ireland. You know, the CCC's balanced pathway at the UK level suggested that Northern Ireland in total should be reducing GHGs by 82% by 2050 rather than net zero. The Assembly, when it passed its Climate Act, went for a legal target of net zero, and the latest advice in March from the CCC about how we might bridge that gap between 82% and net zero, you know, showed us some very challenging figures across all sectors. And, you know, in peatlands, you know, in particular, you know, I think in the first carbon budget, by the end of it, we'll need to be at something like 7,500 hectares per annum restoration. In the past 2 or 3 years, it's been in the hundreds of hectares. So, you know, the challenge is significant. I set out some, you know, some good news on funding sources, but I suppose, you know, what we might need from the peatlands community, I suppose, you know, is support in terms of that capacity building and skills. You know, we recognise the importance of a pipeline, and that's going to be a challenge for us. I suppose an observation I might have is that perhaps our politicians are very supportive in terms of the carbon agenda. Maybe we got some work to do to help to join the dots in terms of the habitats and biodiversity part of the coin, you know, and so evidence around that will be helpful to us as we engage with politicians as and when they come back to show that, you know, whilst, you know, the climate piece is important, you know, as many people have said already today, you know, nature and climate are two sides of the same coin. So, you know, that would perhaps be an area where the wider peatlands community could be supportive of us in Northern Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So, I don't know who wants to respond from the England perspective. How do we upscale and how can we help?
So I'll start. So in terms of, and I'm going to focus a bit more on the grant scheme because that's what I'm closest to. So we've got a target for 35,000 hectares under restoration by 2025, which is the endpoint of the grant scheme. And we're close to that, but we're not quite there yet. So there is more to do. And I think one of the things that we've learned in that is that capacity in the sort of restoration community is one of the things that's stopping us. So it's actually, the grant scheme was great in that it had a multiple year funding, which was something new in England where we've moved from having sort of annual budgets. One of the sort of our pleas to the community is actually having that certainty at the start of the scheme's 4 years worth of funding. We were getting feedback that wasn't being passed on to the community, so it wasn't really helping in terms of capacity. So I think whilst we're getting towards the end of the grant scheme now, there's the opportunity with whatever comes next is actually how do we pass on that certainty around funding, which is one of the barriers we've noticed. I was going to talk about the restoration roadmap, which is, it'd be great. We've got lots of different initiatives, which if you were starting with a clean slate, you probably wouldn't do in the sequence we've done them. But we've got lots of opportunities, so they need to kind of run their course. The roadmap is going to give us that, that sort of pipeline to 2050, and through that we'll understand the barriers much more. So I think it's a bit early to say, you know, exactly what do we need to do, but it will understand, because that is very much a partner-led project. So what is the capacity? What are the barriers within the project? Within the scheme as well, one of the things we've learned is we set an ambitious target at the beginning of it. But actually what we found is there's ambition out there, but restoration isn't a level playing field. So we found that actually a lot of the projects that are coming forward, they're getting harder and harder because the easy ones are done up front. So the ones that are easier to do have been done, and now we're faced with some of the more challenging ones, which might need something slightly different. So maybe it's, we need to look at barriers a bit more. So just very focused on this one. Do you want to say anything, Chris?
Yeah, so if you think about England's lowland agricultural peak, which is about 240,000 hectares, about 2/3 cropland, 1/3 grassland, it's very difficult, is the short answer. We have been, agricultural activities have worked in the ways they are for decades, sometimes centuries, and along comes DEFRA and says, actually, can you reverse this, and can you do something quite different? And there is lots that we don't know. The New England peat map is the first exercise of its sort since 1987, and where we're going towards is a major water infrastructure program. But yes, it's going to be an experimental one necessarily. So, what do we need? We need more information. Absolutely, that's why we're putting so much into R&D, and we need more local collaboration. I mean, one of the sponsors today is Fenland Soil, so it's a great example of a local partnership, farmers getting together, landowners getting together and sharing information, working with government. And we'd love to see that kind of thing rolled out across a country where people want it. Yeah, but it's difficult.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, you caught my eye there, sir. So we'll just take one more question, and then we're going to wrap up and then go to lunch. Oh, we got what? Sorry. Well, we'll have to do two now. So we'll do one online, and then this gentleman in the grey jacket. Are you reading out the question?
Oh, sorry.
Emma?
Sorry. So I've got a question online from Linda Marcus from Yorkshire Peat Partnership, who is asking, I guess it's targeted at England specifically, but probably interested in other contexts as well. When can we expect some movement on the horticultural peat ban in England?
Excellent question, and also not one dealt with my team, I'm afraid. So government's made its intentions clear. In terms of legislation, there's no existing powers that would enable the next steps. So the team, as I understand it, is looking for a parliamentary vehicle and associated parliamentary time for that.
And Claire, what's the timetable in Scotland?
Yeah, I'll just add that we are, as I said in my presentation, our consultation has closed as of May. The consultation analysis will shortly be ready and soon be published, which will inform our timescales. So watch this space very soon.
Okay, sir.
Magnus Matthew Bullock, I'm the treasurer of Fenland Soil. I wanted to raise a question about water storage. I think we tend to have a very dominant sort of top-down view about how we store water. And as we know, yesterday's announcement about huge investments in big water reservoirs. These are multi-billion-pound investments, and they're very, very slow to come through. And I just wonder whether we should be thinking a bit like the sort of analogy of the power industry, where there are much more areas where you could hold water in the landscape, because certainly in the fens, we're just going to need huge more amounts of water, and we can't just rely on that coming to Chatteris or even something through the loop from the Union Canal. So how far are we thinking about farmers being allowed to have much smaller numbers, or much smaller reservoirs on their sites, and then in the kind of the same way as we do with power, enable people to trade water, so that it becomes a more valuable resource in the landscape?
Okay, that's quite a toughie. But
Yeah,
does anybody want to have a go?
I'll start. I think in answer to your question, I don't know. I don't even know whether that thinking collectively have started properly, but my colleagues might be able to come in there. But we need to think differently and innovatively. Where the lowland agricultural peat areas tend to be set up to take water away, and that's a shift in mindset, that's a shift in quite really complicated setup as well, and utilising winter rainfall for summer topping up is certainly one option, and that's part of what these pilots and R&D is about looking into.
Okay, that's a quite complex question, so take that as the answer, if that's okay. Indeed. Yeah, it's a very good point. Okay, we're going to draw a line there. You let me down, actually, because asking you this question about how do we upscale, most people just start with resources, which is going to lead us into the next session after lunch. But that's okay. So maybe resources isn't an issue. Look, thank you so much for all of our speakers. Done an excellent job keeping to time and reminding ourselves of the progress that we are making and the ambition that we need to realize. So thank you to our speakers.